If you go to China, you'll never ever see the world in the same way again. Never. I would argue that China is now probably the global leader, more important than the United States.
大家好，我是小满。今天我们来看一段极具分量的深度访谈。画面中这位长者是马丁·雅克斯，英国资深政治评论员，畅销书《当中国统治世界》的作者。在节目中，他抛出了一个令西方震动的核心观点：中国不仅已经是全球领导者，而且人类正在经历世界中国化的进程。为什么一位西方学者会断言西方框架已无法解释中国？他究竟看到了什么？让我们一起进入原视频寻找答案。
Hi, good day. Welcome to another episode of Unapologetic. I'm your host, Jacques Kareem, and I'm very pleased to welcome to the studio Martin Jacques. Martin, welcome to the show.
Hello.
Martin, if you're not familiar with his work, he's a scholar of many things. He's a political commentator, a journalist, an analyst. But for the last few decades, he's been studying and understanding and learning and communicating to the rest of the world who and what China is. About 17 years ago, he wrote a book, When China Rules the World, which has sold over 1 million copies. You're currently deep in the weeds with a second book on China. I don't know if it's the second, but your second sort of big book on China. You've probably written many things on China, which will come out in 2027. Martin, you on the show today mainly, I think, to do what you normally do, which is to explain to people outside of China how they misunderstand China and how they need to rethink what China is and how China is emerging, or emerged, quite frankly, already as a global leader. I'm going to start the interview in a different way, right? In the sense that before we actually go through China's history and what we don't understand it, normally I'll ask a takeaway at the end of the interview. But if there's someone listening to this, what is the takeaways you would like them to get from this interview?
Well, China is already a great power. You can't understand it through a Western prism, and you should not expect to be able to understand it in those terms. I would argue that China is now probably the global leader, more important than the United States. And that process is going to continue, and we'll see a process of, I suppose, the Sinicization of the world, as opposed to what we've experienced for a long time, which has been the Westernization of the world. By which I don't mean that the rise of China will be any kind of replica of the Western era. I think it will be different in all sorts of ways. And that's what's going to be so interesting.
Okay, so I mean, I was going to ask more questions, but you say it's already the world leader. When you say that, in what way do you mean? Do you mean economically? Do you mean it's in terms of the impact it's having in the direction the world's taking? What specifically do you mean?
Well, it's already ever since 2014. China's had the largest economy in the world, overtook the United States, measured by GDP according to primary purchasing power. Now it's probably about 25% bigger than the United States. It is. It is the number one manufacturing country in the world with a big lead. It is represented in all the new innovations in the economy. In fact, it's really now the engine of innovation, much more important than the United States. In terms of AI, it's probably already the leader in AI, or it's on a par with the United States. And in areas like robotics, even drugs now, I mean, China is becoming, a big innovator. Electric vehicles, you only have to look on the streets to see the rise of China. China's the leader in this area. So in terms of economic, yes. In terms of its trading relationships, I mean, it's a very, very big trading country. It's much larger than the United States. And that's very important because that means that China exists in the context of many different trading relationships all over the world, particularly with the global South.
Okay, I mean, we are going to discuss throughout the interview. We're gonna when we start the sort of the longer discussion. We're just kind of now trying to get an understanding of what the main issues will be. And we'll start with the history. We'll talk about how China has changed, the Cultural Revolution, the impact of colonialism on China. And I think that impacts how both the colonized world, the colonizers in the world think about China, and how the colonized world associates with China, and how the Chinese themselves think back about how they think about the world. We'll also talk about, the sticky issues around China, human rights records, authoritarianism, all those kind of things. But just before we go there, when I hear what you just said, that China is leading economically, it's the biggest manufacturer. I mean, I think most people now who see the economy, see stats, I think the AI debate is something that's probably not settled, but everything else is kind of settled. Definitely, the biggest manufacturer, most trading partners, those kind of things. But the first pushback that comes in my mind is culturally, China seems a lot more insular than, or maybe it's just because I'm part of the English-speaking westernized world that I think this way. But it seems that, the sort of the grip that the Western world has on the world culturally in terms of movies, art, language, that's going to take a long while for the Chinese to kind of, what's your response to that?
Oh, I agree with that. I mean, we've always got to remember, we've got to pinch ourselves and remember that China was more or less an unknown to the world, and certainly the Western world, until very, very recently. This is a very recent phenomenon, probably basically a phenomenon of this century, because in the 20th century, China was pretty invisible to most people, certainly in the way the West views things. And it's the leading edge of its transformation, as is true of all countries, rising countries, is economic. But the impact of other areas and development of other areas usually, I think, lags behind somewhat. And the problem for China is that it is in many ways very unknown. I mean, people don't know very much about Chinese history. And I think if people knew more about it, they'd be both fascinated and shocked by some of the problems that China has had historically. Likewise, in terms of, because the language is so different and it's so unfamiliar, it's very difficult language to learn and so on. So, in a world where the lingua franca has for some time now been English, that makes China that little bit more inaccessible, I think. In terms of movies and so on, yes, I think it's obviously true that Hollywood's dominated this area for a long time, but Chinese movies are becoming increasingly, big sellers, as it were, in China and that area of the world, because we've always got to remember that, the sort of cynic area, if you like, which includes Japan and ASEAN and so on, it's quite a large, has a large population in its own right. I mean, the ASEAN countries' population is about 700 million people. So I think that this is definitely a slower process. I'll give you another example where we're very unfamiliar with Chinese ways, if you like, and that is, the philosophy of China and where it comes from, and the great thinkers, the great sages like Confucius and so on. I mean, people have heard of Confucius. I mean, a lot of people have heard of Confucius, but I don't think their understanding of Confucius is very great, and it's not talked about in the same way as the Greeks and so on. But you can't. This is where it's very important. You can't understand the notion of the individual, the concept of the individual, the relationship of the individual towards society in China without having some knowledge of the historical tradition, because the roots of the Chinese attitude towards the individual and his or her relationship to society is very deep and long running. Now, people, for example, when they're talking about Chinese politics, they say, the reason why the Chinese don't have enough freedom and so on is because of the communist regime and so on. In fact, and you could see this during the COVID era, the Chinese expect and believe in society and believe in the state in a different kind of way to what happens in the West. So therefore, there's an expectation that the state will lead in a way that's opposite in the United States. People don't look to the state and are rather inimical to the state. And this is not so true in Europe, but it's partially true in Europe as well. So there's lots of ways in which, if we want to understand China in a deeper way, socially or culturally or so on, we've got to know something about Chinese history and Chinese thinking.
看完这段访谈，最让我感慨的是马丁·雅克斯的心态转变。作为一个土生土长的西方学者，他在亲眼目睹中国数亿人脱贫，见识了比欧洲更好的公路和高铁后，直言自己的人生被彻底改变，甚至想把西方那一套放一边。这种从骨子里的认知重构，恰恰是对西方长期傲慢的无声回击。综合来看，马丁的评价极具穿透力，他跳出了西方固有的狭隘视角，准确捕捉到了中国不单是民族国家，更是一个文明型国家的本质。他不仅看到了中国在制造业、人工智能及电动车等创新领域的硬核引领，更深刻洞察了中国人基于深厚历史传统对国家的信任与期待。世界正处于百年未有之大变局，马丁所言的中国崛起，并非对西方霸权时代的简单复制，从被殖民列强劫掠的屈辱世纪，到如今构建遍布全球南方的庞大贸易网络，中国正以截然不同的文明底色影响世界。这提醒着我们，绝不能再用西方的棱镜审视自己。中国的复兴不仅是经济维度的跨越，更是5000年文明在现代文明进程中的伟大觉醒与重塑。